NRDC, so Irene, come on out. We've got Holly Wire, who's a senior environmental scientist for the California Coastal Commission, and Mike Conroy, the West Coast director of the Responsible Offshore Development Association. Let's give it a round of applause to these guys out here. Thanks, guys, for coming out when I called your name. That was really helpful, and I think that'll be really good. Do you want to just each take a minute and introduce yourselves before we jump into the questions?
Sure, yeah, just to say a little bit more about myself. My name is Irene Gutierrez. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. This is a really exciting moment in California, and I'm excited to be here and talking with you all. NRDC is very supportive of responsibly developed offshore wind. It's an essential part of fighting climate change and promoting a renewable energy mix. And at the same time, we need to make sure it's done right. And we have some ideas for how to do that, which we'll get into later today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Wire. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the California Coastal Commission. I was the lead staff person on our consistency determination that went before the commission last year. And the commission is also supportive of responsibly developed offshore wind. It's our job to make sure that we consider this along with the range of ocean users and ocean resources as we move forward in the state.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Conroy. I'm the West Coast Director for the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. We are the largest nationwide group representing the commercial fishing industry and dependent communities. I think at last count we had something like 240 members encompassing well over 2,000 or 3,000 fishermen, women, and dependent shoreside businesses.
So hopefully that frames this up for you a little bit. I mean, we've really got people who are responsible for sort of all pieces of this. And let me just start off with the first question here, which is, what are the impacts, whether it's economic, whether it's environmental, whether it's socioeconomic, that you look at when you see offshore wind that you're really the most concerned about? And this time, let's start at that time and come this way.
Well, thanks for that. I think the fishing industry, independent community is very concerned about the impacts not only from resulting from reduction of access to fishing grounds, important fishing grounds. I think we can take some lessons learned from the East Coast, but acknowledging that the infrastructure that's proposed to be used off the West Coast is different and will have different limitations. But as I said, access with regard to impacts to the shoreside communities. We're going to see competition within the ports for limited amounts of space, how marine mammals and their migratory patterns might be changed, because that is a key to one of the state's most valuable fisheries, the Dungeness crab fishery. And then fisheries management. I mean, to the extent that long-running surveys that our friends at NOAA do that help inform the stock assessments, if those are disrupted, that'll negatively impact harvest levels and things like that. And then just in terms of, and that's referencing the amount of that is known, right? There's so much that remains unknown, and that's a big fear for the fishing industry. If this is going to impact upwelling, which is the primary driver of productivity off the West Coast, how is that going to cascade and have ecosystem-wide impacts? Those are things that we're still hoping to learn more about. So that scratches the surface.
Well, we're going to scratch a little bit more, but let's go on to Holly.
Sure. So under our federal consistency review at the Coastal Commission, we look at how these projects affect a range of policies that are in Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act. So that includes things like continued viability of commercial fishing, environmental impacts to marine resources. We also consider environmental justice impacts to coastal communities. So really, you were asking about what the impacts are, and the impacts can be all of the above. So we really take a holistic look at these projects and the potential impacts that could occur to seabirds, marine mammals, fish stocks, you name it.
And I'll add a couple more things. The size of offshore wind development is massive. The turbines, the platforms, the mooring systems. So one of the things that NRDC is really concerned about is impacts to benthic habitat, which, as Mike and Holly have mentioned, is really essential for a healthy and functioning ecosystem, healthy and functioning fisheries in California waters. So that's one concern that NRDC has. Also, given the nature of mooring systems, there's a lot of lines that are anchoring systems to the bottom, anchoring turbine platforms to each other, and these pose entanglement risks to marine mammals, sharks, other types of creatures that use the waters here. So we also want to make sure that entanglement risks, either primary or secondary from debris that's caught in those mooring lines, are minimized. As we've seen from onshore wind development, there's also the risk that birds and bats can collide with wind turbines. That's yet another risk that we're concerned about. And as Mike mentioned, there are many unknowns and many unknowns as well. So there's a lot of data that needs to be gathered in the coming years about what offshore wind development means for creatures that use the California current ecosystem. And we look forward to collaborating with regulators and with developers about how best to do that.
And yet, I think it's safe to say that at the same time that we're sort of looking at all these impacts that you guys are saying, you'd also say on the other side of the coin, but yet we need to move quickly to help stave off what I used to say a couple of years ago will soon to be the worst impacts of climate change, but many places around the country are already experiencing that. We know that clean energy is going to be the way to do that. There's many people here that have fought to make California a leader on clean energy policies, and so we're doing that. And so it becomes rather having to do two things at the same time. We have to accelerate the drive or the move to 100% clean energy, and at the same time protect. There's the great threat that we have from climate change, and there's the great threat that we have from species extinction, and we have to be able to manage that at the same time. What role does the state play in helping to be able to do that? And this time, let's start on this side.
I think that we've seen some examples for how this has been done well in the past. For example, in desert renewable energy, there have been ways that clean energy has moved forward and environmental concerns have been balanced. As to what role the state plays in guiding this process, I think the state has been a really valuable and thoughtful partner in regulating offshore wind development. So things that the state can do is making sure that the environmental review processes are thorough and robust, making sure that permit conditions or operating conditions are thoughtful and balance sort of economic concerns and moving the industry forward with environmental protection. And I'm sure Holly can share more detail about the process of the Coastal Commission.
Well, some of what comes to mind when you ask me that is a bit of what Kate talked about earlier on the permitting side, which is the coordinated approach among state agencies and really bringing all of our expertise together to look at the impacts of these potential projects and develop a coordinated set of solutions for them so you aren't going one by one to figure that out. So leveraging that approach to also address all of the impacts as well as the permitting issues. I'd also say that one thing we flagged in our consistency determination was the need for having a really robust environmental monitoring program coming along with these offshore wind developments. Looking at because a lot of these impacts are going to be larger than just the traditional way you think about a project where you're looking at just the project and maybe an area nearby. Some of these impacts are going to be through things like displacement that happen at a much larger scale than the individual leases. So we really need a coordinated approach that looks at those impacts and takes them on in a systematic way to maximize efficiency and maximize our resources.
Yeah, no, and this is a great question. And speaking from experience, there have been a number of state agencies that have really stepped up and been very helpful throughout this process. We've had good working relationship with some of the federal agencies as well. In particular, our good friends with NOAA and NIMS have been really helpful. And I think to the extent that can be leveraged, as Holly and Irene both noted, I think that can be helpful. But Holly just pointed out something that at the forefront of our mind as well is, when we think about the 5 gigawatts that's planned off California today, and then the 20 more that's coming, we also have to consider there's going to be offshore developments off Oregon. There's proposed offshore developments off Washington. So what is going to be the cumulative impact of all this? One of the speakers earlier was really speaking about taking a programmatic approach to looking at the impacts of this. And that's something that the fishing industry, and I know some of our environmental friends have been lobbying hard with BOEM to do that, rather than this segmented piecemeal project approach. We need to understand what the big picture is and what the impact's going to be overall. I think if we can get to that point and have the state support that, so we can really look at this holistically, as Holly noted, I think that's going to be very important.
Let me ask another question then, just based on that, is what can we learn from people that have already started to do this? So, there's some projects that have started on the East Coast. They're sort of in a nascent stage, but there's projects that are happening in Europe that have been there for several years. There's projects that are happening in Asia that have been there for several years. I know it's easy to sort of say, oh, California's different, and I think everyone here knows the coast and the drop and floating and yada, yada, yada. But really, there has to be stuff that we can sort of take from there that would really help us to be able to say, these are the best lessons learned here. This is what we can look at what they're doing over here and say, and apply that to California. And again, taking aside that there are those particular differences. But Holly, let's start with you on that one.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we can look to, at least at the East Coast, is the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. That is the entity that they've set up to deal with that sort of larger than lease scale issue of tracking impacts across the whole East Coast, and taking some of the, not necessarily the specifics of the research, although some of that may also be really valuable, but taking the structure and the approach that they've had and learning from that. I think that one of the really interesting things about that process is that it is bringing together NGOs, government scientists, and developers to develop these science projects for these larger than lease scale issues. And one of the things that does is that brings everyone along and helps them buy into what the science is saying. And it's an independent process, and it makes it more verifiable and more trustworthy when the results come out. So I think that there's a lot that can be learned there from a process standpoint.
Oh, me. I think that we should be guided by what we have learned on the East Coast, but not reliant upon what we've learned from the East Coast, for a number of reasons. Number one, the BOEM process has changed from what it's been going through there to here. I mean, we've seen the process in California is vastly different than the process in the Gulf of Mexico, and we'll see what's going to be happening in Oregon in probably not too distant future. I think we can learn from what's happening in Europe. There's more and more science coming out that isn't modeled science, it's observational science. And I think to the extent that we can learn from that, acknowledging that the floating infrastructure is different. So there are going to be different impacts. I know there are a few, I don't know the exact number of floating offshore wind turbines that have been deployed worldwide, but nothing on the scale like that's being proposed for here. I think we have to be at the forefront of considering and planning and thoughtfully thinking out, how do we approach this? How do we do it collaboratively, as Holly noted? I think there's a way to do it and get it so that we're, like I said, we can draw from what happened on the East Coast, but set the table our own way.
Before I get to you, Irene, because I know you want to talk, I mean, there's obviously a bill in the state legislature, AB 80, that's authored by, I think, Assemblywoman Addis and State Senator John Laird, who we heard from today. I think NRDC and the Monterey Bay Aquarium are the two sponsors, along with a list of people who are supporting that. Talk a little bit about that and sort of why you came up with that. Is that a model you looked to the East Coast for and said, hey, look, they've got this over here, we need this over here? And then let's get into that a little bit, like, okay, well, once we get it, how fast can we use it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with what Holly has said, and that there really is a need for a coordinated, centralized science entity that takes a landscape approach to understanding what the data on the effects of offshore wind development says, understanding what additional gaps there are in that data that need to be filled, either through additional research, through ongoing monitoring to sort of track how wind development affects an ecosystem over the course of decades. And also it provides a mechanism for funneling funding to where research is really needed. And what we've seen, so NRDC has a seat on the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative on the East Coast. And it seems like it's been a fruitful collaboration between government agencies, industry groups, academia, environmental nonprofits, to share ideas, to strategize about how to address priority needs and to cooperate. And ideally, there'll be efficiencies from that kind of process going forward. And we'd really love to see that on the West Coast, because similarly, there are many data needs here. And as Mike and Holly have mentioned, floating wind is something really new. This will be the largest scale floating offshore wind development in the world, and we really need to understand what that means for the really vibrant California current ecosystem. And I guess for next steps in moving that forward, ideally we'll have an entity at the end of the legislative session, and then it'll get to work. So the process on the East Coast has been, there's a steering committee that sort of helps guide the work of the science entity. There are different subcommittees that take closer looks at different species and species impacts, and they put together a plan for how to move the research forward. And I think that the science entity on the East Coast has come out with a plan, a draft plan, earlier this year, and so it's been an order of, I guess, 1 to 2 years in doing that.
Mike, is that something that you guys are supporting, that bill, or sort of that concept, and how does that work for you on the East Coast, and sort of what can we learn from how your folks are dealing with that on the East Coast and bring that to the West Coast? Because I think sort of the nightmare scenario that a lot of us think about on offshore wind is sort of right now, and this conference is a really good example of it. We all sort of can come together still. We're still friendly enough that we can sort of come together and be like, hey, ha, 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 AB80 or what have you, and, move things along. And if we disagree, we can still sit at the table and sort of move forward. It becomes bad if we stop doing that. And if we just start going, oh, well, we're not going to work together, we're not going to do these things, and, there's all these roadblocks that you can imagine that get thrown up that sort of either isolate groups so that they get cut out of a process altogether, or slow things down so much that we're not solving this problem of climate change and how do we do it. So again, we're still at this sort of nascent stage on sort of the West Coast, even though I know some people are saying 2016, and even before that people have been working, but comparatively, it's relatively new. When you hear Irene talk about that, sort of where are you on this?
Yeah, so we haven't taken a position on the bill. I've had conversations. Yes. Correct. Yeah. Okay. I've had conversations with one of the sponsors, and now that I know there's another one here, if folks that were left off of the initial list of potential stakeholders in that group were added, then I think that would help. In terms of what we learned, I will claim complete ignorance on how the East Coast Science Collaboratives work. I've been with Rhoda now for, 6 months, and I'm primarily focused on the West. I think the fact that I haven't heard any complaints from the fishing industry probably speaks volumes, given that we're an industry who is loud at times and vocal when we sense displeasure with things. So that's my response to that. That's fair. I've just put you on the hot seat, so let me ask the same question of you, where Mike is sort of saying, hey, wait a second, there's a stakeholder issue here, and he's saying, I think in coded language, he's looking for sort of a seat at that table, and are there other groups that should have a seat at that table, or how do we go around sort of creating seats for people who are going to be stakeholders? Yeah, a couple of thoughts about that. I agree with that wind is an industry that's going to affect many aspects of California ecosystem, California economy. So not just fisheries, but also labor, communities that live around wind development areas, tribal nations, tribal groups. So there are many stakeholders that need to be part of the process of equitably and responsibly moving wind development forward in the state. And I think it's really important to take those different voices into account, so appreciate that point. I would also say that wind is at an interesting place in the particular regulatory moment that it's in. Like, we are having very open conversations, not just Mike and I and our respective groups, but also with developers, also with government agencies. So I think that there's a lot of interest from the stakeholders and agencies involved in collaborating and trying to figure out ways to align our interests and move things forward. And maybe I'll take you off that seat for a second, because you could also say, maybe not all, if this is going to be a science-based regional wildlife collaborative,
are there other tables where we would have stakeholders that would make more sense? So everything that's based on science, maybe there's some stakeholders that don't want to be involved in that science program, but see themselves more involved in a workforce development program, or are there ways that we can be training more people and there should be another program that's set up that looks like that? I'm not asking anyone to comment on that. I'm just sort of pontificating off the top of my head. So, but maybe let's go to, sort of to riff on that and to think, a lot of times when we hear about offshore wind now, especially on the East Coast, we're hearing about the death of whales, and a lot of that has been blamed on offshore wind, which seems, even though it's been proved now that that's not the case, but still it's in the media. But Mike, you're raising your eyebrows saying, well, we don't know about that, so maybe we've got a spot here that we can talk about. But this seems like one of those places where we have to figure out how to be clear on science and reporting, because again, I don't want things to slow us down in this field that are based on half-truths or sort of misleading statements that sort of one group can make. And how do we correct for that and sort of make sure that we continue to use the best science when we're going forward? And I'll open it up to anybody to start, but Holly, you look like you want to go. So
I mean, I think that kind of circles back to what I was saying earlier about some of the value of the East Coast model of bringing all the parties together to look at the science, because if you have that in place, you're able to address things like this that come up. Adaptive management is going to be a huge part of offshore wind on the West Coast. We can use proxies to understand the impacts to the best that we can, but we aren't really going to know until the turbines are in the water and we're monitoring them. So we do have to be ready to adjust if we need to do that.
Yeah, and I think that there are some helpful examples from other regulatory contexts for how adaptive management could be done. So for example, in onshore wind development, if certain take thresholds are reached, there have to be mitigation measures that are put into place. Or in other contexts, like in the fisheries context, for coastal pelagic species, there are certain thresholds, again, that if those thresholds are reached, you have to adjust the amount of fish that can be harvested. So, I think that there are many ways to be creative and many examples from other regulatory contexts for how to do adaptive management. And then there also needs to be thought, as Holly has noted, of taking the information that we're gathering either through the Science Collaborative or through ongoing monitoring processes on permits and feeding that into the management process and updating as we go along.
Yeah, and if I can just go back, you might raise my eyebrows when you talked about the East Coast marine mammal issue that's going on. The best way to dispel this, and it especially raised it when you said it's been proven, because I don't think it has, right? I don't think that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. I think that it is true that they have not done a necropsy on an animal that has showed that the survey activities have had an impact, but they haven't done necropsies on all of the animals. So, there is circumstantial evidence, right, based upon the increasing number of strandings that have happened over the last 5 or 6 years that coincide with the increased survey activity. There's circumstantial evidence that shows that there could be a connection, but we can't prove it either way. So I think, our community in particular that has held such a high standard with regard to interaction with marine mammals kind of looks at what's happening there and rightfully is questioning. So the best way to dispel misinformation is to produce verifiable information proving a point.
Right. And I guess the question is, do you feel like the Science Collaborative on the East Coast has been strong enough in being able to disprove that? Now, some of it you're saying they haven't done, the studies that would conclusively prove that this is not. I think there would be studies that would say, accidents with ships, entanglement with sort of the ghost fishing gear has led to a whole set of problems. But what can we put in place here so that we can help to dispel, so that when that, we sort of know certain things are going to happen. We know offshore wind is going to start coming to the West Coast. We know animals are still going to wash up on our shore, sadly, that will have died. Instead of going down this path that we're seeing people on the East Coast go down, where we start pointing the finger at each other and start going, oh, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, what kind of steps can we take now to sort of go, wait a second, we have to step back from that. That doesn't really get us anywhere. That puts us into this path that I was really describing that I don't want us to go to, where we sort of, everyone goes to their own corner and just sort of goes, I don't want to do anything moving forward here, when really we all have to lean in and come to the same place and figure that out. So what do? Do we have examples from either the East Coast or from other places or other projects altogether where you're thinking, well, here's something that we did with, the desert work that we did, or how do we make it so that that doesn't end up the place that we end up?
Yeah, I think part of it is just having really thorough data collection and making sure that for things where there are data gaps, that there's either monitoring or a plan to fill those data gaps. And then, there's a science to it, there's also an art to it. I think that in other contexts, there's a lot of modeling that goes on into how different events, like whether it's, in the fisheries context, climate change, harvest, other changing ocean conditions, how those affect the populations of creatures that we care about. So, there's some black box where a lot of complicated modeling and thought needs to happen. And then on the other side of that, there are recommendations that then guide management and maybe require some changes in how projects are operated or how certain management conditions are put in place. So, I think that good data, figuring out how to fill data gaps and using that to inform management decisions are some of what can be done here.
I'd like to add on to that and also add good communication of the data. I think that having a venue to bring, information like necropsy reports from, deceased whales or that sort of thing, bringing that to a venue where the concerned stakeholders are and making sure they understand what's happening and what NOAA's findings are can go a long way towards dispelling misinformation and getting into that place of pointing fingers at each other and not necessarily having the information that we need.
Yeah, no, I agree with what both Irene and Holly have said. I think if you can develop a methodology for how you're going to address certain things and make that adaptable, living document, if you will, so that we can adapt to what we're learning on the fly, especially given how little is known about floating offshore wind in the larger context of the size that's being proposed off the West Coast. I think that'll go a long way toward providing comfort that the information that is being provided is based upon valid observations and the like, and not just an assumption or summarization.
Well, and that gets back to a difficult question, and you were sort of getting into it, Irene, when you're sort of saying, well, you got to take that science and put it into that black box. But it seems to me that at this point, that science is changing almost every day. And on the ocean, I don't know if this is true, but I'm just going to say we've probably reached the amount of carbon that we can put into the ocean. And so every day that we're going more and we're spewing CO2 and other climate pollutants into the air, if we haven't maxed out on the ocean, we're probably coming pretty close. And so at what point that when we start to tip on that and the science is going to go a little haywire, I think, it's going to be really challenging to sort of say, this was the problem to this particular result out there. Mm-hmm. How do we stay together, stay with ourselves, when there's going to be what looks like science is going to be much harder to come to an agreement on issues, because the environment in the ocean has been so altered and will be altered so tremendously that are there ways that we can move forward on this? I've got puzzled looks, so I might have to skip to a different question if no one has anything. But
are you asking how to tease out the effects of climate change compared to the effects of wind development?
Well, that's part of it, but it's like, I think we just have to say, the ocean doesn't look what it did 50 years ago, and a large part, there's any number of reasons that you could attribute to that. It's I don't know how many dump trucks worth of plastic that we dump into the ocean every 10 minutes, but it's a phenomenal amount. I don't know the, amount of sort of stuff we're taking out. You could organize the ocean and say, we're taking too much good stuff out and putting too much bad stuff in. And we have not settled on that. And now we're throwing in the danger of climate change, which sort of hurts that ability to be clear on the science I would say. So we're going to establish these regional wildlife science collaboratives, assuming we pass the bill, which let's hope that we do. But how do we protect ourselves from being able to use the science as effectively as possible? Again, we might have stumped everyone on this one. So.
No, it's a complicated question. I mean, the ocean is a really, really complicated system. So I guess
I know it's a little complicated, more than I'm saying in and out, so I get that, but thank you.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of how other agencies manage it. And I guess Mike and I met because, when I first started at NRDC, I did fisheries work. And the Pacific Fishery Management Council comes out with an ecosystem report every year that looks at all of these different factors. And it factors into account, as part of that, climate change. So I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. But there are ways of understanding all of these complicated inputs that go into a system as complicated as the ocean, and then understanding what are the different levers that you need to push, pull, slow down on in order to affect that system. And, I guess this question also gets to adaptive management. So, you have ways of modeling what different stressors do to an environment. And then adaptive management, done the right way, provides ways of incorporating that in an ongoing way into projects that are already in the water or on the ground. Other thoughts?
I think I would say, at least for some of your question, we do have some very long-standing data sets from NOAA that have been collected for many, many decades. And that's part of what those agencies are using to measure some of the effects of climate change. So I would want our data collection for these projects to be in that context, in that we can look at trends that are already happening and use that to help us understand what may or may not be attributable to a specific, project or action in the ocean. But you're right, the ocean's a complicated place, and it can be hard to tease out exactly, what caused a certain thing to happen. That being said, adaptive management of these projects is really important, and that's something we want to build in moving forward.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Holly just said, and Irene as well. I mean, Holly just hammered home the need to, as we're considering these developments off the West Coast, the need to protect that data sets, the NOAA data sets that she's referencing. Those are based on transects, and we need to work towards those. And you're also right. Things are different today than they were 50 years ago. Things, in some senses, in the fisheries world, are better today than they were 50 years ago. What we're seeing today that's different is a more of an ecosystem-based approach to how we manage our fisheries. Looking at the entirety, and then also looking into the future and doing integrated ecosystem assessments that are designed and intended to kind of look to the future and how these things, offshore wind and all these other things, need to interact with each other so that one doesn't overburden or run over the other.
I'm going to switch topics a little bit, but I might come back to this one because I kind of like pressing this button. But Holly, you've been praised both by the executive director of the California Coastal Commission for the consistency determination that was done. I know there were many people on that team, but you were really one of the main players on that. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you think were sort of the best pieces in there? And were there any pieces that were sort of left out that if you could go back and just say, oh man, we should have added these two things, and then we'll ask these guys as well.
I think some of the best pieces were the overall approach we took of having our conditions essentially set up processes for the lessees, for stakeholders to go through, for us to go through, to get us the information we need when the consistency certifications are turned in, and make sure that we're ready with the data and with the stakeholder involvement that we need to consider those. So I think that as an approach was just a really great outcome, and I'm excited to watch it start playing out. I think the other part of your question is a little harder for me to answer. I feel like, earlier I said we really look at all the things, but that isn't entirely true, and that you can look at a wind project and say, if a port's developed in the Humboldt region, that would likely cause increased needs for things like housing and all sorts of other services that are not necessarily directly, in our I guess we do CDPs for housing sometimes, but it's not directly under like the CDPs we're looking at for wind. So, I think that it would be great to see sort of the big picture of what this looks like for those communities moving forward, even though we can't necessarily do that through our specific process.
Mike, is there anything you saw in the consistency determination that you thought, this is great, you were proud of the Coastal Commission for the work, and then is there anything where you were thinking,
Section 7C.
maybe for those of us that haven't read it, a little more on that?
Yeah, so that's the provision within the conditional consistency determination that established a working group. And this working group is to be filled with members of the fishing industry, members from the offshore wind industry, and other stakeholders as well. I think the fact that the Coastal Commission, through this action, developed the table and set the table and invited everybody to the table, I think that's all that we asked for in leading up to that. It's, how the table mates act is outside of their control, but I'm sure that they'll rule over that. And I just want to echo what you heard earlier, all the work that Holly did on this. Kate, if you're here, thank you for doing that. And Amanda, if you're listening, thank you for all the work that you did on that. In terms of what wasn't there, I could nitpick, but I'm not going to.
I appreciate
Okay.
that.
I'll just say that I appreciate what was done, and I guess with the next either consistency certification or the next CD, we'll pick up there.
Yeah, I really appreciate the work that you did, Holly, and others on the Coastal Commission. There were some really good things that came out of that process in terms of benthic habitat protections, in terms of avoiding entanglement risk and making sure that there are eyes on the water, and just good observation and good monitoring requirements. And so I think that there were really protective things that came out of that process. And it's also really great that they were incorporated into the lease terms for the California wind leases. So I think it's a really, we're really fortunate in the state of California to have a strong CZMA process, and one where the dialogue between the federal government and state agencies really matters and really has an influence on what the regulatory landscape is.
Maybe one thing I'll add, and I didn't prep you guys with this question, but it just feels like it's right to me, is one thing that I feel like we do need to talk about here is that we're giving our state agencies more work to do, but it's not commensurate with more funding that comes to be able to do it. Something like the consistency determination is really challenging to do. As we've just described here, things are only going to get harder, not easier. We're going to have to figure out ways to increase the funding to the state agencies so that they can have the resources that they need to be able to come up with the kind of a decision that you can see people here on this panel who might not always agree, they like that project there. From a sort of working with the offshore wind industry, what do you guys see as sort of some of the key pieces that you need going forward in order to be able to work with them on whether it's fisheries protection, whether it's some of the work that you're doing or some of the conservation work? What are the key pieces that people in the industry should take away, should be writing down here, and should be thinking, this we got to nail?
Well, a regional science entity is key for the next stages of wind development, so we very much welcome collaboration and dialogue on that. I guess another piece of that is securing funding for that entity. So the model on the East Coast for funding the entity is that the procurement process and procurement contracts generate some money for the entity, which is maybe not precisely the solution that we have available to us in California, but that's another area where it could be good to put some collective thought to that and figure out how to make that happen.
And that we probably need to do sooner than later, since there's both, you have your bill AB 80, and there's the procurement bill that's moving through the state legislature that we'll be hearing tomorrow at 9:30. So people should contact you after this and say, hey, we want to get involved with that and figure out how to do that. Holly?
I think we would like to have a lot of coordination with the lessees, especially as they're developing all the plans that were called for in their lease stipulations. Through our CD, we were able to get review of those plans, so we really just would like to continue coordinating and working with you. I think beyond that, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for more resources, but I think that there's one person working on offshore wind at the commission, and that one person is me. So, and the work is just going to be increasing. So
You can't ask, but the rest of us can.
yeah,
So
I don't think
that's
I
the
can
good
ask for
news.
that. So just to say, like, there's one person right now, and the work is only increasing. So more resources will eventually help us.
No, I agree with what both Holly and Irene have said. The staffing is an issue. I mean, we've seen it in our interactions with the state agencies. We've seen it in our interactions with the federal agencies who interact with the state agencies. But we're seeing more and more kind of collaboration there. And I think that's going to be helpful. In terms of, we're not, the fishing industry, and I understand that it's not an easy industry to engage with. It requires a level of detailed knowledge that I don't think people outside the fishing industry have. So if I were to put a plea out to the 5 leaseholders and potential leaseholders elsewhere, either in California or in Oregon in the not too distant future, reach far, reach wide. Think that, you know, the fisheries that operate off the West Coast are truly coastal. There are fishermen from San Diego who fish up as far as Washington and vice versa. So you got to spread the net wide. That's a really bad analogy for a fisheries.
Yeah, not
thing.
one that the fishing guys, I think, want to.
But cast a wide net. Is that better?
We'll think of something.
Yeah. So, but you know, it's been encouraging over the last little bit. You know, the Pacific Fishery Management Council is trying to take a more active role in it, partnering up with the state agencies that feed into the PFMC, and seeing, like I said, with NIMS working closely with the state agencies as well. It's very comforting.
It feels to me, and it seems like, that now that there are 5 leaseholders here in the state, they've been doing a lot more work at the regional level. You know, sort of really getting into the communities, starting to have these conversations. You're giving a face of saying, well, maybe not. So what more should we be doing? Should they be doing?
Yes, let me jump in on this first. So the leases haven't been signed yet. So that's from our perspective. You know, once the leases are effective, there is a certain deadline to have their different communications plans established. I think for the fisheries communications plan, it's 120 days. You know, once the leases are signed, our organization intends to reach out to all 5 lessees to do an open call, not to discuss any details on what their plans are to mitigate or eliminate or reduce impacts to the fisheries, but rather, you know, here are the folks for each of the lessees. Here are the fishing individual participants from up and down the coast who are interested in what's going on off the coast, just to sort of start developing those conversations. Because I think it's going to be important for, like I alluded to, the fishing industry that operates off the West Coast is complex. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon the developers to take it upon themselves to ensure that the reach that they need to make, that they're making.
Okay, before we get to questions, let's take this minute and just sort of see what are sort of the coolest new inventions that are coming out there that are either helping us to examine and preserve and protect the ocean. Are there new fishing gear? I mean, it looks like sometimes you look at fishing gear and you think, well, this has been used for 40 or 50 years, but is sort of there new stuff coming out that we can look forward to? And how do we use sort of the best minds to both get the best data that we want, but then also get the best fishing gear that we want?
Yeah, I think that there are some systems that are helpful at avoiding wildlife impacts that are already in use or close to being in use. So for example, on the East Coast, so birds and bats are attracted to certain types of lighting systems. So on the East Coast, certain wind projects have automatic lighting systems that only go on when aircraft are near. So you're not attracting as many birds and bats that way. So things like that. There's simple technology that is in use that can be deployed on the West Coast to help manage impacts here. You know, or there's detection technologies like visual detection technologies or technologies that are sensitive to pressure on the catenary lines and other lines that are used to moor wind systems to the ocean floor into each other that could detect if a creature is entangled, or fishing nets are entangled. Again, seemingly a low-cost solution, seemingly could be used here. So there's things like that where maybe there's a sweet spot in this helps manage risks and is not a big, it's not going to be that painful to the pockets.
Your question brought up for me a webinar I saw recently where there was some technology using heat detection cameras to look at seabirds and how they're interacting with wind farms, and they essentially are aiming to create a system where you could detect birds on sort of a macro scale on how they're interacting with the farm as a whole, use the heat detection on sort of a middle scale to see are they going, down the middle of these, turbine rows, and then you have actual sensors for collisions on the turbines themselves. And so seeing how those packages can come together and really give us a full picture of how wildlife is interacting with offshore wind was really exciting for me.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a new invention or new gear type, but I know, especially this year, our salmon fishermen are really looking forward to the Klamath dams coming down. We're starting that process. We're looking at, this year, the commercial and recreational fishery out in the state of California is closed. That's probably going to be replicated next year. Hopefully, the dams coming down will restore habitat, will help rebuild those runs. It'll be great for the dependent communities, both the tribal communities and the fishing communities up north. So I know that our community is very excited about that and hopeful that'll be a real good way to restore and rebuild those populations that our dependent communities in the north are on.
I think you'd get a lot of support from that in this room and probably from, except for the hydro fanatics. But, we're going to need the clean energy. But your point is really well taken. I think there's opportunities to get there. Let me push back a little bit. But really, are there no 21st century gadgets that we can use to be able to tell if a lobster goes into the lobster pot so that we don't need the line, or we can use a GPS thing so that we can really decrease some of those floating lines? Or I know I'm asking as a novice, but there's got to be some stuff out there.
Yeah, I know you're headed on this. There are ropeless technologies out there for our fixed gear fisheries that eventually could be promising, but they're just not there yet. The failure rate, before I was with ROTA, I was with the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, and we had individuals that were participating in pop-up gear testing, and at a failure rate of 10 to 15%, it doesn't take that many pulls of your gear before you have no gear left. And at $1,200 to $2,000 a pop for that gear type, it wasn't financially doable. And then, of course, the other thing is where your gear is, but no one else does. And if I'm using a gear type like a pursine gear and I go and wrap up all of your traps, it's not only are you going to lose that gear, not only is it going to destroy my net, but it could have some serious impacts on the health and safety of my crew members. That was then. Maybe next year, maybe the year after, that technology will improve, but it's not there. It's not ready for prime time yet. So.
Okay. We're getting almost to the end of our session. I don't know if the app is working to be able to ask questions. I know I've got a couple more questions that I have to ask people. I'm looking off stage to see if there's any queue here. I think the questions are supposed to pop up on the screen, in which case, okay, great. Well, so let me just close out and just ask this question. What are the next steps? And Holly, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Mike, and then we'll end with you.
I'd say the next steps are continuing to work to build up a science collaborative with our agency partners and external partners. Also to really get the Condition 7C working group up and running. That's another thing that we will be getting going in the next couple of months.
Next steps, great question. The 7C working group, working, hopefully engaging with developers, working toward their fisheries communications plan, continuing to get the foundational work done on what science we know, what science gaps there are. Shameless plug for ourselves, about a month ago, we put out a publication with NOAA and BOEM called State of the Science on Offshore Wind. It was primarily focused on fixed infrastructure. We have plans for later this year to start holding workshops looking at floating offshore wind, sort of make that an appendix to the Synthesis of the Science report that came out. So that's that, and then just continue to engage. And from our perspective, we got to look at the whole coast-wide approach, because while we're focused here today on what's happening off California, we also have to be mindful that 3 gigawatts or more off Oregon, and I think there's the potential, the unsolicited lease requests off Washington, total 5 or 6. I mean, and then if we're going to go to 25 off California, that's a lot of steel in the water, and we try to understand what the impacts of that may be.
And just before we get to your closing, how do we sort of take into effect sort of a West Coast view of this? And really, we need a whole West, we can't, it's not like, obviously the fish don't know the state borders, but they also don't know the national borders. And for a lot of these animals or these mammals, they're starting very far up north and coming very far down south. And we're really going to need some kind of not just intrastate, but international agreements to be able to look and to monitor and to mitigate for issues that are out there.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. If I don't know what Canada's got proposed off the West Coast, if there's thinking about offshore wind there or not, but if they are, it would seem that it would be prudent for the U.S. to engage with Canada just to get we need to get a holistic picture of what is planned, so that we can know what we're dealing, rather than, which has been one of our complaints since day one, is this kind of piecemeal approach, lease by lease approach. We got to look at it holistically, and if it's going to extend up into the Gulf of Alaska, that would be good to know. If it's going to extend over into Hawaii, that would be good to know as well.
Yeah, there's a lot coming down the pipeline. Site assessment, construction and operations plans, permits for onshore development, like transmission and portside build out. So I think just being really thoughtful about the environmental review that goes into all of these processes, taking a coordinated approach between the different state and federal agencies could be really helpful as well. And making sure that there are protective conditions in place in all of those different processes as they go forward, and good stakeholder engagement to make sure that all stakeholders and communities are being heard from in that process. There's a lot, and it really does feel like time is of the essence because of the climate crisis we're in, and I think that there's also time to do this all right and do this thoughtfully.
Well, I was going to have something to close with, but you've really sort of nailed you've just nailed it, I think. We need good data. We need good stakeholder engagement. We need sort of a promise from all of us, I think, that when things get tough, we lean in as opposed to sort of going out. There's going to be a lot of difficult conversations to come, but I'm pretty sure that we can get through those conversations, and science now says we have to get through those conversations if we're going to help create this balance that we need out there. The threat of so much of what we're dealing with is at our door, and it's easy to retreat, it's easy to go back, it'll be easy to point fingers, but I think it's really going to take, you all here, everybody out there in the audience, the millions of people who have to sort of change, adapt, and see what's coming, and figure out how they're going to take part in it, and that'll be really important. So I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to give a huge round of applause for these 3 incredible speakers here. I think that's our cue to get up and out. So thank you all.